Hello and welcome to my channel. It's the height of the Cold War, and the world is on edge. The threat of nuclear war looms large, and proxy conflicts are being fought all over the globe. One such conflict is happening right here in Vietnam. When it comes to Vietnam, there's a lot that can be covered. But in order to keep this video relatively short, we're going to focus primarily on America's involvement. If you want to learn more about the broader conflict, I recommend watching a documentary or doing some further reading. Now let's jump in. After the French were driven out of Vietnam in 1954, the country was divided along the 17th parallel with the communist-backed Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or North Vietnam, to the north, and the U.S.-backed Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnam, to the south. Both the North and the South wanted to unify the country under their own rule. But neither side could agree on how to do this. Talks between the two sides failed, and in 1955, South Vietnam's president Ngo Dinh Diem rejected the Geneva Accords, which called for nationwide elections to be held in 1956 to reunify the country. Tensions were high and both sides began building up their militaries. The U.S. was concerned that the spread of communism would destabilize the region and saw South Vietnam as a critical ally against the spread of this ideology. So they began providing them with financial and military aid. Diem's regime, however, was far from perfect. He was increasingly authoritarian, and many of his policies favored his own religious group, the Catholics, over the majority Buddhist population. By 1960, protests against Diem's regime had become widespread, and the U.S. began to worry that the growing instability in South Vietnam could lead to a communist takeover. In response, they increased their military presence in the country with more troops and more sophisticated weapons. But despite these efforts, things didn't really go according to plan. On January 30th, 1961, Diem was assassinated in a coup backed by the CIA. Although the coup leaders promised to hold free elections, they quickly established a military dictatorship. This made the U.S. look bad internationally and gave North Vietnam an opening to accuse America of trying to turn Vietnam into another puppet state, like South Korea. They also charged that the U.S. was using the coup as a cover to send more troops to the region. And with that, the conflict was on. In 1962, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong guerrillas launched a major offensive across South Vietnam, seizing several key areas and inflicting heavy casualties on South Vietnamese and American forces. This convinced Washington that the situation in Vietnam was dire and drastic measures needed to be taken. As a result, President John F. Kennedy began planning a major escalation of U.S. involvement in the conflict. Unfortunately, JFK would never see it happen. He was assassinated in November 1963. But his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, was already convinced that Vietnam was critical to America's national security. In March 1965, North Vietnam launched the second phase of the Vietnam War. This time, attacks were not only conducted by the Viet Cong, but also by North Vietnam's regular army, the People's Army of Vietnam, or PAVN. The PAVN was much stronger than the Viet Cong, and its larger size allowed for more conventional tactics. Things really started to go downhill for the U.S. when on February 7, 1965, a group of PAVN commandos attacked a U.S. airbase near the city of Da Nang, killing 8 Americans and wounding 78 others. This was the deadliest attack on an American base since the attack on Pearl Harbor. Naturally, Johnson ordered retaliation. On February 16, Operation Rolling Thunder began. This was a sustained aerial campaign against North Vietnam. The U.S. hoped that by bombing North Vietnam, they would force the communist leadership to end the war, but it didn't work. The bombings caused massive devastation, killed hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese civilians, and pushed the North Vietnamese people closer to the communists. Later that year in July, the U.S. sent 40,000 combat troops to fight on the ground in Vietnam. From 1965 to 1967, the war escalated rapidly. The U.S. sent more and more troops to Vietnam and became increasingly bogged down in the conflict. The U.S. expected that, with its superior firepower and technology, winning the war would be a walk in the park. But they were wrong. They kept getting bogged down in ambushes and suffered heavy casualties. It's not only that, but the jungle terrain and oppressive heat and humidity made life in Vietnam miserable. To make matters worse, there was still no clear end in sight. The Tet Offensive was launched by North Vietnam in 1968. Its main goals were to destroy South Vietnam's infrastructure and deal a death blow to American morale. The offensive involved surprise attacks on both South Vietnamese and U.S. bases throughout the country. It was one of the largest military operations of the war and caught the Americans off guard. Despite suffering heavy losses, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army were able to capture several key areas, including the cities of Hue and Ca San. While the U.S. eventually prevailed in the offensive, it was a costly victory. Over 200 Americans were killed, and the North Vietnamese lost an estimated 40,000 soldiers. But perhaps even more significant than the human cost was the effect the Tet Offensive had on public opinion in the United States. Many Americans began to question the war and whether it was truly winnable. TV broadcasts of the fighting showed graphic images of the war's toll on both sides, something that previous generations had not had to endure. These broadcasts created a visceral reaction among those who watched and prompted many to demand that their government bring their sons and daughters home. As the war dragged on and casualty rates continued to climb, anti-war protests became more common. In 1968 alone, there were over 3,000 anti-war demonstrations. Then came the My Lai massacre in March of that year. A company of U.S. soldiers went on a rampage through the village of My Lai, killing hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians. The incident was kept secret for several months, but when it was exposed, it caused an uproar in America and around the world. The My Lai massacre symbolized the brutality of the war and led to further calls for peace. Johnson decided not to seek re-election in 1968, perhaps because he knew he couldn't win. That year, Richard Nixon took office, promising to end the war. However, despite his promise to bring the troops home, Nixon continued to escalate American involvement in Vietnam. In 1969, he ordered the invasion of Cambodia, which led to even more violence and instability in the region. Nixon claimed that the Cambodian incursion was necessary to strike at the North Vietnamese supply lines and bases, but it only served to widen the scope of the war. As more and more Americans died in Vietnam, public support for the war waned. By 1973, only 26% of Americans supported the war, while 53% wanted U.S. troops withdrawn immediately. Public opinion had turned against the war, and Nixon finally agreed to end America's involvement. On January 27, 1973, peace talks were held in Paris, and the United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed a peace agreement which provided for a ceasefire and the withdrawal of all U.S. troops from Vietnam. The war was finally over. But the story doesn't end there. In April 1975, Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces, and Vietnam was once again unified under communist rule. The war had been a costly one for all sides involved. But perhaps most tragic was the impact on the Vietnamese people. An estimated 2 million Vietnamese had been killed in the conflict, and millions more had been wounded or displaced. But perhaps most important was the effect the war had on the people of the United States. For many, the war had been a traumatic experience that left them physically and emotionally scarred. The war had divided the country and left a legacy of bitterness and resentment that would last for generations. So what can we learn from all of this? Perhaps most important is the need for caution when dealing with foreign conflicts. The U.S. became involved in Vietnam because it feared the spread of communism. But in doing so, it unleashed a conflict that would eventually claim the lives of over 58,000 Americans. The war also highlighted the importance of public support for military actions. The U.S. public was never fully behind the war, and this lack of support ultimately contributed to its end. Finally, the Vietnam War serves as a reminder of the human cost of war. The Vietnamese people suffered greatly during the conflict, and it is important to remember their sacrifice as we reflect on this dark chapter in history. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe.